Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I've got a fabulous story for you this evening, so I'm so glad you've joined me. And don't forget to go and get that effervescent sparkling drink or something lovely and warm to drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the year was 1941. Growing up in those days, I wasn't a brave boy. My younger sister Lola was much more courageous and wise than I was. It was her suggestion that we should run away from home to look for our grandmother Rosa, on my mother's side of the family, who only lived a couple of hours' drive away from us. We had her address. We knew if we found her, that our lives would be so much better. We could move in with her and never have to live a moment longer under the same roof with our wicked stepmother. In the early years of my life, my birth mother had read stories to us about wicked stepmothers before, but until then, I had always falsely assumed that such fictional, unsavoury characters were fictitious fairy tales, but now I knew differently. I discerned that stepmothers could be as treacherously conniving and vindictive as the malevolent characters portrayed so eloquently in storybooks. I knew this, as a stepmother had indeed made a fortuitous, unwelcome appearance in our lives, and after her serendipitous arrival, nothing was ever the same again. She was like a festering disease in our home that became more and more malignant, like an aggressive, unbridled cancer that could not be tamed or suppressed. We lived in North Carolina, in a rather quirky little white wooden farmhouse, on a small plot of land. My real mother had become ill after being diagnosed with serious depression. She was being treated at a mental facility at the time, where they were giving her electric shock treatments for her depression, which, looking back, I believe did her more harm than good. My father had been given legal custody of us, as my mother was deemed as unfit to take care of us at the time. It had saddened our young little hearts to see my mother so broken up, so fragile, so delicate, so vulnerable. My little sister described my mother like Humpty Dumpty. "You can't put the pieces together again," she explained to me. "Mummy is broken, like Humpty Dumpty, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Maybe the doctors won't be able to fix Mummy either." Our mother had been the apple of our eyes growing up, but we were witness to her gradual emotional decline, which soon became physical, as her health began to wane. I remember she became thin, refusing to eat. She was always crying, and it became a laborious challenge to get her out of bed every morning. She would tell us to leave her alone. She just wanted to curl up and die. It all began after my mother gave birth to a stillborn child. It was losing that baby that had driven my mother to the edge of her despair. She had carried that baby to full term, but when it was born dead, my mother was so devastated after her baby's death that she never fully recovered from her grievous loss. My parents buried their baby boy in a cemetery, giving him the name Christopher. In the end, my father could not cope with my mother's vacillating mood swings and the all-consuming desolation that had hijacked her life, robbing her personality of its former effervescence. She was grieving the loss of her baby so much that she almost forgot about the rest of her family. The subdued, crestfallen woman my mother had become was a sorrowful shadow of what she had once been. We had always known her to be fun-loving and colourful, but not anymore. I'd often hear my father arguing with my mother, telling her to snap out of it, get a grip, that life wasn't a bed of roses, and that things happened in life, and she should get over it. "For God's sake, Hilda, people die, children die, it happens. I'm sorry we lost our child, but you are not the only person who's lost a child in the world, you know, nor will you be the last. You need to pull yourself together, woman. Get on with your life. I'm sick of you mooching around the place, feeling so dreadfully sorry for yourself. Other people have it far worse than you, but they manage to rise above the storm. You need to pull your socks up, sweetheart.
You rarely do.
I'm trying to pick up the pieces of my life, Robert. I really am, my mother had cried out indignantly. But I feel completely desolate, as if a black cloud has swallowed me whole.
Stop being so dramatic, Hilda. As I keep telling you, you need to pull yourself out of this lugubrious melancholia. It doesn't become you. You have 2 children that need you now. I need you. How about trying to focus on the living, rather than mourning the dead? It's the living that need you. Little Christopher is in God's hands now, and is being well taken care of.
I remember one day 2 men in white coats came to pick my mother up. They spoke to my father earnestly. I could see them from the kitchen window, nodding heads. My mother was screaming, fighting back, as they ruthlessly dragged her to their truck. And then they were gone. She was gone. I cried sorrowful tears when I saw my mother leaving the house. The men in white doctor's coats had been rough with her, showing her no mercy or compassion. They were treating her as if she was completely insane, or even a danger to herself. We asked my father who the horrible men in white coats were that had taken our mother away from us. He exclaimed to us that our mother was suffering from a very serious disease called depression that needed special treatment. What is depression? I'd asked my dad.
Depression is when you're very sad all the time, and it's so crippling that you can't live a normal life. Your mother has gone to a mental health facility to get ongoing treatment for her condition. In the days that followed, my mother's mother, our grandmother Rosa, would come to visit us regularly, and she and my father would have these heated rows about my mother. My grandmother was furious that my father had sent my mother to this mental facility, believing that my father had overreacted, sending my mother to a place like that, for in those days they viewed even depression as a mental illness. Thanks to you, Robert, the medical professionals I spoke to think my daughter is loopy and as mad as a March hare, and you know she's not. When is she ever going to get out of that medical facility? The place is like a dreadful prison. There are bars on the windows and doors. The other day when I visited her, they tied her down with leather straps to a gurney. They were giving her sedative injections. That is not normal. My daughter's not receiving the correct treatment. She's depressed, for God's sake. She's not a raging lunatic. The treatment she's receiving is barbaric. These men in white coats should be locked up for what they're doing to my daughter. And Robert, I hold you responsible for sending her to this macabre place. My father had fought back indignantly. It's the only place for her, Rosa. My wife is seriously sick. She needs help, professional help. These people know what they're doing.
Do they really? Said my grandmother, raising a cynical brow. I think they're making my daughter's condition 1,000 times worse. That place is more likely to kill her than to save her.
If you're not on board with the choices I make for my wife, Rosa, then I'd kindly like you to leave right now.
My father had told my grandmother she was no longer welcome in our lives, and that had been that. But what about my grandchildren? Grandmother Rosa had protested. I have a right to see them, you know.
Get out,
my father had screamed. Me and my sister Lola missed Grandma Rosa more than words could ever say, and we also longed to see our mother again. When we broached the subject with our father, he was non-committal and vague, saying my mother was in the best place for her current condition, and it wasn't advisable to see her at such a critical stage of her treatment, as it would only worsen her well-being if she were to see us. I couldn't comprehend my father's irrational, nonsensical reasoning. If my mother was sad, would it not make her happy to see us again? Wouldn't seeing us give her the motivation to get better, so she could leave that desolate place and finally return back home? Weeks later, me and my sister were both horrified to learn that my father had divorced my mother, and in no time at all he remarried a woman called Wilhelmina, that we secretly called the witch. From the moment she arrived on the scene of our lives, it was like a tsunami had hit our home, as the happy, easygoing lives we had once known became completely derailed. I couldn't comprehend why my father would marry such a dreadful woman, whom had no redeeming qualities whatsoever, but my father didn't see it. He spoilt Wilhelmina in a way he had never spoilt my mother, and bought her everything she could possibly ever want. She lapped it all up like a pampered pooch. I'd never met a woman so in love with her own image. She would tirelessly remove the mirror from her purse and study her reflection all day. Indeed, I was surprised that her smug, self-satisfied face hadn't actually cracked the mirror. "It's like Dad is seeing her as a beautiful princess, isn't he?" my sister had pointed out to me. "When in reality she's an ugly, ugly, ugly toad. Dad is blind to how grotesque and vile she is. Even her words are like poison. I can't stand her. She's evil. Mum was beautiful on the inside and out, but this woman, she's gross." I knew my sister was absolutely right. She may have only been 10 years old, but she had a wise head on her shoulders and was sharp, astute and discerning like an owl, along with being a very good judge of character. "You're a boy," she asked me suddenly. "Do you think that Wilhelmina is pretty?" "I'm 11 years old. I'm not going to find anyone old pretty, am I? Especially not someone married to Dad. Wilhelmina is old. She's in her 30s. She's ancient. Old people are never pretty," I told her. "Yes, but if you were 30, do you think you'd find her attractive then?" I frowned. My sister could ask some strange, impertinent questions that I'd never given any consideration before. "I'm not sure. I suppose she's better looking than some people her age, but she's a horrible person, so if she's pretty or not, it doesn't count, does it?" "I mean, sourballs look very nice, don't they? But they taste bitter." "You've got a good point there," said my sister reflectively. "But remember, some people like sourballs, so maybe that's why Daddy likes Wilhelmina." I could remember the first time Dad introduced us to his new wife. He looked as proud as Punch, as if he'd won the lottery. It was like he thought Wilhelmina was such an asset, as if in some way having her on his arm had elevated him from owning a Ford to a Lamborghini. He had never been that proud with my mother on his arm, and seeing him like this made me nauseously sick and very protective towards my mother. I saw Wilhelmina as an unwanted intruder in our lives. I remember my dad was grinning from ear to ear, like a very foolish Cheshire cat who had got all the cream. Too bad he didn't realise how sour the cream was. If he had truly tasted it, I'm in no doubt he'd have thrown up. When he introduced us to Wilhelmina, he said, "This is your new mother," half expecting us to jump up and down for joy. "She's not my mummy," I said. My sister had stamped her foot and reiterated my statement. "We don't want another mummy. We're happy with the mummy we've got. We don't want another one."
"Now that's not the way to talk to your new mother, Alex," my father told me. "I want you to apologise to Wilhelmina for being so rude."
"She's not my mother," I piped again. "I'm not going to apologise. Why should I apologise when I'm speaking the truth?"
"Give them time, my sweetheart," said my father, wrapping an affectionate arm around Wilhelmina. "They just need to get to know you better. And when they do, I'm in no doubt they will adore you as much as I do." I was to learn my father had known Wilhelmina for 3 weeks. They had dashed over to a registry office to tie the knot. It would seem my father was a fast worker, and as soon as his divorce had been finalised with my mother, he had another woman in his arms. It wasn't a good look, and there was a lot of nasty scandal and gossip going on in our hometown about the affair. Most people were disgusted with how my father had abandoned my mother and replaced her with someone else. I overheard one woman at the greengrocer saying to her friend, "That, my dear, is Robert Lewisham. Men like him make me sick. It's the reason I never got married myself. I mean, look at him. He looks as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. He dumped his own wife, put her in some kind of mental institution because she was grieving the loss of her stillborn child. He then married that Wilhelmina woman. None of the locals like her at all. I'm not sure where she comes from, but she's very stuck up and very opinionated. Thinks she's better than anybody else. Obviously a city girl, if you ask me, who thinks us country folk are an inferior breed. She's a nasty piece of work. It's those children you have to feel sorry for. The man's just replaced his own wife. I can't imagine what those poor kids feel like. Well, this Wilhelmina, she's quite easy on the eyes, isn't she? Robert Lewisham looks like he's locked under her spell." "More fool him," said the woman. "He's making a complete idiot of himself. He thinks that everybody in town is admiring the woman on his arm, when in reality everybody is mocking him and laughing at him behind his back." When we first met Wilhelmina, she eyed us through her dark, soulless eyes. She was wearing a summer dress covered with a pretty meadow and a tiny pink belt around her narrow waist, which matched her shoes and her purse. I noticed she had very big feet and hands, which contradicted the feminine physique she boasted. Her lips were perfectly painted, a bright scarlet colour, and she had long spider's legs attached to her eyes, which I was to learn later was actually false eyelashes. Whenever my father was not looking, or paying attention, that is, Wilhelmina treated us like the dirt under her shoe, that deserved to be trampled, pushed around, crushed beneath her forceful heavy feet. She was always rudely ordering us around, telling us to do chores around the house, to scrub floors, wash windows, iron clothes, get the fire started in the hearth, peel the potatoes and carrots for dinner. "I told you to wash the dishes," she'd scream at me. "Now do it, or I'll send you to bed without any dinner. Honestly, you're such a disagreeable young man. My bet is you take after your mother in that lunatic asylum. If you don't watch your back, you'll be joining her there too. What do they say? The apple doesn't fall very far from the tree." I wanted to defend my mother. I really did. But Wilhelmina scared me. There was something disabling about her that made my blood run cold. "Yes, ma'am," I would say dutifully, scurrying to the sink to wash the dishes, wondering why the woman barely lifted a finger herself. She was desperately lazy and got us to do most of the stuff around the house, always taking credit for the chores herself, claiming to my father that she'd worked hard all day, cleaning windows and polishing furniture, when in reality she had made us do the whole damn lot after we returned from school. "If you tell your father you did the cleaning, I'll fry your hamster in the deep fat fryer," she'd warned me. I didn't doubt her for a moment. She was cold and callous. It was like she was the queen bee, and we were her workers. She always was telling our father that we had misbehaved, even when it wasn't true, and always looked incredibly self-satisfied when our father would send us both off to bed. Suffice to say, with Wilhelmina now in our lives, our loving relationship with our father deteriorated immeasurably, as she did her damnedest to turn him against us by telling him we were the most disagreeable, unlovable, spiteful brats that she'd ever had the pleasure to meet. "What is wrong with you kids?" she would snap at us. "Why are you always misbehaving?" There was no point telling our father that Wilhelmina was horrible to us. He wouldn't buy it. He saw the woman through rose-coloured spectacles, and in his eyes she could do no wrong. One day she was angry with me for not cleaning the downstairs toilet. "I'm not going to clean it," I had protested. "You do it. It was your sister that got sick in there. It stinks. There's vomit all over the floor. She's your sister. You do it." Wilhelmina had invited her sister and her husband over for dinner the previous night. Her sister had got violently sick, hurling up the contents of her meal in the downstairs toilet, and the splatter of her vomit had barely made it to the toilet bowl, and had crusted itself over everything. Wilhelmina had bullied me enough, so I was determined to stand my ground. More fool me. There was no way I was going to clean that mess up. I remember she'd fried us hot chips for lunch. Then she brought my plate over to the downstairs toilet and threw the chips on the floor, rubbing them into the filth with her shoes. "There's your lunch, Alex. And if you don't eat those chips now in front of me, I'm going to put Snuggles, your hamster, into the deep fat fryer." The woman forced me to eat the sodden chips covered in urine and sick in front of her, or my hamster was dead. I knew she would do it, so I ate those disgusting chips and threw up violently afterwards. Soon me and my sister began to loathe Wilhelmina. Sometimes she would sprinkle so much salt over my food that it was inedible, and my father would shriek at me for not eating my dinner. I would see Wilhelmina smirking. She rarely looked so satisfied and thrilled when my father became angry and belligerent with us. Of course I tried to tell him that Wilhelmina was an awful woman, but he never listened. It was like telling him the earth was flat or the sky was green. He had these preconceived ideas about the woman,
and he couldn't agree with anything we said. I could understand why he believed her to be like sugar and spice, as that is how she behaved towards him.
Oh, Robert, you must put your feet up. You poor thing. You've had such a hard day at the office. How about I get you a nice cold beer and some warm, lovely toasted peanuts? Oh, your shoulders are so tight. You're knotted up. Let me give you a nice massage, Robert. Oh, I bought you a really stunning sweater today. I thought you'd like it. She'd fuss over him like a celebrity. My father loved every minute of the attention she devoted on him. We would watch him become so beguiled by this woman. But he didn't know that, like the moon, she had a dark, insidious side that was far from attractive, and that this woman did not wear her heart on her sleeve. It was the day when she came close to deep-frying my hamster that I decided enough was enough. Wilhelmina was irate with us for not picking apples from the orchard. She wanted to make an apple pie for my dad. And I will say this for her, she wasn't half a bad cook. We had become distracted and began to play hide-and-seek out of doors together. She came barging out of the house, wearing a disenchanted expression, an ugly scowl on her face. She wanted to see how we were getting along with picking the apples from the trees because she thought we were taking far too long. "Why haven't you picked any apples yet?" she shrieked, her dark eyes blazing like red fiery coals. She looked like the devil's spawn. "I asked you to pick them half an hour ago. What is wrong with you children? You never bloody listen. You're as loopy and disobedient as that kooky mother of yours in the mental asylum." "Sorry, ma'am," I said. "We'll pick the apples for you now, I promise." I could see that Wilhelmina was furious. Her face was burning a bright red colour, and her unbridled body language was aggressive, as she oscillated her arms above her head indignantly to express her level of exasperation. "I've had enough of you children. You pick those bloody apples for me now, you hear me? I want them in 10 minutes flat and no later, do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," we both said. She grabbed me by the collar and glared at me, her eyes meeting mine. Her nostrils flared, and the furrows between her brows developed into deep crevices. "What did you say, Alex?" I was trembling in my boots as she glared at me, because the woman had killer eyes that spurted a vile poison. "I said yes, ma'am. We'll pick the apples for you right now, and we'll deliver them to you in the kitchen in about 10 minutes. No later, I promise." "How many times have I told you, Alex, to call me mother?" "But you're not my mother," I protested indignantly. "I am your new mother now, Alex." "Right, that's it," she said, storming off. "Where are you going?" my sister asked me. She looked frightened. "We better pick the apples. Wilhelmina is going to kill us if we don't. We've only got 10 minutes. I had a deep-down prognostic hunch that Wilhelmina had another plan on her mind, and to my horror I saw her dashing downstairs with my little hamster in her hands. The oil was bubbling on the hob, and Wilhelmina was leaning over the hob with little Snuggles in her hand, ready to pop my chubby little hamster into the hot oil. I could not believe it. I didn't hesitate to run over to her. I pushed her over so she landed on the kitchen floor, wincing in pain. She'd sprained her ankle. I didn't care. "Look what you've done, you dreadful brat!" she cried out. "How dare you! I've sprained my ankle." "I'll get you for this," she growled. "How dare you push me over like this?" I immediately retrieved my very frightened hamster and quickly put her in her cage, hiding her somewhere where I knew Wilhelmina would never find her. I got into awful trouble that evening when my father came home, as Wilhelmina told him that I'd pushed her over deliberately. She failed to mention, of course, that she was about to deep-fry my hamster. "Dad, you don't understand. Wilhelmina was going to—" "I don't understand, son. What do you take me for? I understand very much. You're growing into an objectionable young boy. It's unacceptable behaviour for a man to lay a finger on a woman. Least of all, push her over. You're going to bed without any supper tonight. But before you go, I want you to apologise to Wilhelmina for your insolent behaviour. Do you understand, young man?" "Yes, Dad, I understand." Wilhelmina smirked as she watched me having to apologise for pushing her over. I'm sorry, Wilhelmina. I'm sorry for pushing you over.
Correction, Alex. You've said it all wrong. You're supposed to say you're sorry, Mother, for pushing me over, she corrected me. I'm sorry, Mother, for pushing you over. Good boy. All is forgiven, Alex. I don't think it'll be necessary, Robert, to send the young boy to bed without food. That would be cruel in the circumstances.
But he pushed you over, sweetheart, said my father. You sprained your ankle.
Wilhelmina let out an exaggerated sigh. I've forgiven little Alex here, haven't I, dear?
You're far too kind for your own good, sweetheart, my father had interceded. Very well, Alex, you can have dinner with us tonight. But next time you pull a stunt like that, young man, you'll be sent up to bed without any dinner. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, Dad, I said, hanging my head bashfully. Dad, you don't understand what's really going on here, said my sister Lola, intervening. If you would allow me to explain, none of this is Alex's fault. Wilhelmina is responsible.
Watch yourself, young lady, said my father. You're not going to cast any judgment on my wife. Do you understand?
Yes, Daddy.
Good girl. Now let's enjoy our meal in peace, shall we? It looks a fine spread we have here. What is it, Wilhelmina?
It's beef stew and dumplings with mashed potato and corn bread.
Looks perfectly lovely, Wilhelmina. Doesn't it, kids?
Yes, it's lovely, Wilhelmina, we both said. At the next opportunity I got, when we visited the local town, I quickly hurried off to the pet shop, and I slipped little Snuggles under my sweater, popping her in a cage with the other hamsters. I privately cried as I said goodbye to my little pet, but I could not afford to risk Wilhelmina getting hold of her again. I told Wilhelmina that my hamster was dead. Oh, thank goodness for that, she said without remorse. They're like Vernon, aren't they? I can't for the life of me understand why anyone would want a hamster as a pet. Quite nonsensical, if you ask me. Cats are much more civilized. Especially if they're black, I said, thinking a black cat would go very well with a witch, including a broomstick, of course. Wilhelmina didn't get it. Actually, I do rather like black cats, she admitted. I hate her, I told my sister when we were upstairs in our bedroom together. I really hate her, I said, my eyes brimming with tears. Have you seen how she has Dad wrapped around her little finger? He's so fooled by her. I think we should run away, my sister told me. I can't live under this roof with that obnoxious woman a moment longer. We need to get away from here. My sister was bright as a button. The teachers at her school described her as having wisdom beyond her years. She's like a very old head on young shoulders, Mr. Lewisham, my father had been frequently told. I'm astounded by some of the things she's come up with in class. I have to remind myself that your daughter is only 10.
She must take after me, my father had told the teacher. I was always very bright at school.
I knew the teachers weren't talking about my sister in regards to her academic prowess. Granted, she was good at school, but the teachers were actually referring to her emotional intelligence. And as bright as my father was, he lacked that shrewd reasoning. If indeed he had been more insightful and discriminating, he'd have seen what was really going on under his own roof, and how desperately unhappy we were, living under Wilhelmina's implacable heavy hand. If my father had been prudently pragmatic and commonsensical, my birth mother, for example, would have received professional counselling rather than being sent off to some kind of mental asylum to receive treatment. Did you hear me, Alex? Said my sister, giving me a firm, urgent nudge. We can't go on living here. Wilhelmina is a witch. We need to get out of here. We'll go to Grandma Rosa's farmhouse. She'll be so pleased to see us. We can live with her there. I'm not sure, I said hesitantly. I'm scared to run away. Don't be ridiculous, Alex, my sister had said. Do you want to be a doormat all your life and allow that witch to bully us like this? We deserve better, so much better than this. I will admit, I had been too afraid to take that leap of faith. Even if our home lives were miserable, we had food in our bellies and a roof over our head, and we also had each other. In my opinion, we should just grab what we could get and live with the consequences. But my sister was not prepared to live with the status quo.
You're not happy? I'm not happy, Alex. We need to find Grandmother Rosa. We need to go and live with her. Remember Wilhelmina tried to deep fat fry your hamster? She's seriously sick in the head. Now listen, I've got Grandmother's address. We don't live too far away from her. It's possibly a couple of hours by car, which means a lot longer by foot, but we can walk there. It won't be too hard. I have a rough idea where she lives. I always used to watch the journey Mum took when she drove to Grandma Rosa's house.
I was not feeling sanguine or optimistic about abandoning our current lives, however messed up they might be. I was not like my sister. She had guts, spunk, and steely grit.
What about school? I asked her. When we find Grandma Rosa, she'll place us in a brand new school. I know you're going to miss our school and our current friends, but that just can't be helped. Anything is better than living with that witch. In the end, I was encouraged and compelled that me and my sister should indeed run away from home.
Lola could be very persuasive if needs must, and leaving behind a toxic, pernicious household seemed like a great idea. Me and my sister gathered a bag together. We packed some cookies, water bottles and sandwiches for the journey that we would soon undertake. We had decided when it became dark, we would slip out of the house when my father and Wilhelmina were fast asleep. It must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning when my sister finally woke me up. I remember it was dark outside. When I glanced out of the window, I felt rather intimidated by how black and inauspicious everything appeared. It seemed uninviting, and my bed infinitely cozier. I did feel reluctant to leave. My sister was younger than me, but she displayed no reticence about bracing the gloomy darkness to find our grandmother.
Are you ready?
I'm ready, I said.
Are you sure you want to do this, sis? I asked.
She frowned at me.
You're not losing your nerve, Alex, are you?
Of course not, I said.
I just want to make sure you still want to go to Grandma Rosa's. Do you think I'd have woken you up if I changed my mind? Now let's go, but be quiet about it. We don't want to wake up the house.
I had slept in my jeans and sweatshirt overnight, so I didn't have to get changed at the last minute when I got up. I crept cautiously down the staircase, following my sister. We were both wearing only our socks and carrying our sneakers in our hands. Our staircase used to creak in protest when you walked down it, so wearing squeaky sneakers may have woken up my father. I knew if he saw we were running away, he'd do his nut. My sister had the bag in her hands, with our scant provisions, and we had a couple of my father's torches. My sister left a note for my father, telling him we were going to live with Grandma Rosa, and not to come looking for us.
Sorry, Dad, we had to leave. We're not happy living with you and Wilhelmina. We want to live with Grandma Rosa. Love, Lola and Alex.
Me and my sister clandestinely pulled back the sliding door in the living room. It made an annoying scratching sound, which was terribly loud to us. We closed it quietly behind us, tiptoeing onto the porch. Once we were safely outside, we put on our sneakers, tying them in knots to ensure they didn't come undone. My fingers were trembling nervously. I was even more aware of how dark it was outside. The moon was ungenerous, with only a faint sliver of moonlight shining down upon us, and a scattering of silvery stars, and even they didn't seem as bright as I remembered. I wasn't used to venturing out at this time, and it was a strange experience. But the reassuring sounds of the crickets and frogs seemed to calm my somewhat ruffled nerves. I was bewildered at how my heart began to pound so violently in my chest so that I could hear every single vibrating beat. I couldn't believe we were actually doing this, and I wasn't exactly sure how I felt about our decision, but we were here now. There was no going back. There was no changing our minds. When me and my sister trekked over the meadow towards the woodgrove, the idea was we were going to take a quick shortcut through the woodgrove to the road on the other side, and then cross through the next wooded area and the next until we reached the main road. This way we could shorten our journey significantly, so we thought. We ambled through the dew-laden grassy meadow, towards the tenebrous silhouettes of the towering trees, a mix of red maples, sweet gums, tulips and pine trees. I knew this woodgrove very well during the day, but at night it had morphed into a whole different, rather inauspicious place that smelt of moss, pine and earth. A light wind whistled through the trees, It had become bodefully menacing. The trees began to jiggle, and the wind changed, stepping up a notch or two, moaning like a grumbling old man having a bad day. It made me feel ever so slightly nervous, but I kept my focus on the torchlight and the path ahead. It wasn't easy walking in the woods at night, with the jagged rocks angrily jutting out of the ground, and leaves, bracken and underbrush littering our path. We had been walking for ages, but when the first signs of winking morning light began filtering through the trees, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Everything was soon washed in an ethereal golden light, and a welcoming pretty glow. The crickets and frogs were now muted, to be replaced by the happy trills of the bird song. We walked the entire day through the trees, but we couldn't find a road, and we began to realize that we might actually be lost. That was when we found an old run-down farmhouse in the middle of the woods, which was the weirdest thing we'd ever seen, as there were no driveways from the woodgrove that would lead out to any road. The farmhouse was completely surrounded by trees in every corner. It was built of stone, and looked like it was ancient rather than modern. Me and my sister peered through the windows to see if there was any sign of life, but the place was completely empty. There wasn't a soul in sight. We opened the door and walked around the farmhouse, and the only way I can describe it as representative of another time, for there were no modern influences in this house. The ancient kitchen boasted pestle and mortars, butter churners, and ancient wood-burning stoves, and everything was as clean as a new pin. But there wasn't a soul in sight, but we knew someone must live there. If we hung around, maybe they would return to help us find our way out of this maze. I remember once getting lost in a cornfield, but this was 1,000 times worse. I felt as if we were walking through the trees forever, going around and around in circles. Our hearts were now heavy. We knew we were lost, but my sister insisted if we continued walking straight ahead, we would finally meet up with another road. But alas, that never happened. Our hearts grew heavier and heavier. We were hungry and thirsty, and we'd finished all our supplies, and that was when we saw her. I remember being bewildered to see this woman. She was not wearing any clothes, but was covered in long, dark, flowing hair. She was as big as a giant, but in truth I was so glad to see her. We hadn't seen a single soul for ages, apart from a scattering of deer that bolted from us the moment they saw us. We saw the occasional squirrel, rabbit, hare, and chipmunk. This hairy lady was so human-looking that I didn't doubt she was human, but she had exceptionally long arms. She was strong, lofty, powerful, and majestic. At such a young age we were much more accepting of this idiosyncratic woman than we would have been if we had been 5 or 6 years older. I don't think even for a fleeting second we felt intimidated by her. In truth, we should have been, given her gargantuan size. My sister hurried up to her and pulled out the photograph of Grandma Rosa's house from her jean pockets to show the hairy lady. The hairy lady snatched the photograph from my sister with her very big hands and studied it closely. She became animated to see the picture and started making a chuckling sound at the back of her throat and pointing to the house and to herself again and again. I could tell by the expression on her face that she knew the house well. "You know it?" my sister asked her, sounding delighted. The hairy lady, we discovered, couldn't speak a word of English, so she spoke to us in a rather strange language that seemed to be automatically translated in our heads. And even though this was happening, we didn't find this odd at all. "I know this place. I know this place," she kept saying to us in our heads. "Hipata pipo, apata pipo." My sister was flooded with relief. "Can you take us there, please?" The hairy lady nodded. She led us away in a completely different direction than we had been going. We had been heading north. She was leading us in an easterly direction. I could see she was frustrated with how slow we were in moving forwards. She scratched her head and spoke again in her strange language to us. "Hipatani, homati pasa." "You're too slow," she said. "I need to carry you." "We don't mind," we told her. We were glad to be lifted off our feet, as our bodies ached with tiredness. We were exhausted and very thirsty. Our energy was flagging. The hairy lady threw us on her back, me on her right shoulder, and my sister on her left. We held on to her tightly as she glided efficiently through the woodgrove. She seemed to gallop like a horse and moved with such a grace. There was none of this jolting or jerking up and down movements that you might expect. It was like she was floating. I could hear her breathing, and I noticed she smelt strongly of pine, dirt, and moss. It was not an unpleasant smell. She smelt exactly like the forest. At one point, she stopped at an obstreperous stream, where the water thundered and crashed ebulliently over the sculptural rocks. Me and my sister drank the crisp, refreshing, cool water very gratefully, and the kind, hairy lady led us to a berry bush, and we stuffed ourselves silly with berries until our hunger was satisfied. She then threw us over her shoulders and carried us on her back for many ages. It was as if we were as light as a feather to her. Me and my sister were so comfortable that we both fell into a peaceful sleep. Finally, she lowered us on the ground. I couldn't believe it when I opened my eyes, to see we were actually standing outside Grandma Rosa's house. I've never felt so happy, so relieved in my entire life. It must have been early evening. We could see the farmhouse was prettily dappled in a soft moonlight. Me and my sister impulsively hugged the kind hairy lady. She returned the favour, but hugged us very gently. We thanked her for delivering us safely to the farmhouse, but we noticed she never left until she was sure we were safely received by Grandma Rosa, who was thrilled to see us. "Your father was here, and so were the police. Everybody's been looking for you." We told my grandmother all about Wilhelmina, and my grandmother told my father everything she'd learnt about our treacherous stepmother. When she told my father that Wilhelmina had tried to deep-fry my hamster, that really rattled him. He seemed to wake up from his blinded oblivion. The rose-coloured spectacles seemed to fall off his face. I'm glad to say he allowed us to stay with Grandma Rosa until he divorced Wilhelmina. But the news got even better. Grandma Rosa persuaded my father to allow my mother to return home. Let's see how she gets on. When my mother did return home, she bounced back to be the mother that we always loved. I think the relief of being away from that mental asylum snapped her out of her depression. She and my father got remarried and were happier than ever. I don't know how she could have forgiven him for getting her committed. Suffice to say that mental asylum was brought to its knees by Dwight Eisenhower and is now an abandoned building that is considered haunted. It was only when I was much older I realized the creature we'd encountered all those years ago was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.